On April 14, 1832, Parish Judge Etienne de Lille signed a document that would expose one of the most disturbing intersections of paternal power, property law, and human commodification in antebellum Louisiana history. The document, archived as a marriage conveyance in the St. Martin Parish notarial records, transferred what appeared on paper to be a standard dowry arrangement. In practice, it sanctioned the sale of a 16-year-old girl, Evangeline Boudreau, by the very man sworn by both law and nature to protect her. Her father, prominent planter Jean-Baptiste Boudreau of St. Martin Parish. Witnesses who were present in that courtroom later recalled the careful language employed that April afternoon, the euphemisms that masked the transaction's true nature. This was not called an auction, though that is precisely what it was. Instead, court documents refer to it as a contracted placement, language designed to sanitize what was occurring within those walls. The court scribe, following the dictation of Judge de Lille, recorded a single line that would prove chilling in its brevity and its implications: consent duly affirmed. With those 3 words, a 16-year-old's future was signed away in a room that witnesses described as heavy with the scent of molasses and tobacco, the commercial crops that drove Louisiana's economy and in many ways, its moral calculations. The investigation that would unfold more than a century later revealed that this consent had been engineered through a calculated combination of guardianship manipulation, debt restructuring, and what medical records would suggest was sustained psychological terror. The ink on Judge de Lille's signature dried quickly that April afternoon. But the stain it left, on a family, on a community, on a legal system that allowed a father to monetize his own child, would endure for generations and ultimately expose systematic vulnerabilities in how Louisiana's unique civil law system intersected with plantation economics and paternal authority. Before we examine how this case came to light, how archivists pieced together a transaction that a parish had deliberately obscured, and what it reveals about the mechanisms through which vulnerable individuals could be legally traded under the guise of marriage arrangements, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This case, though rooted in 1830s Louisiana, raises questions about consent, coercion, and the ways legal systems can be weaponized against the vulnerable, questions that remain relevant across all communities today. Your perspective matters as we examine how institutions meant to protect can sometimes become instruments of harm. The story of Evangeline Boudreau is one of institutional failure, economic pressure, and the ways that respectability could mask exploitation. It is also a story of resistance, small, quiet, but ultimately effective, and of the women who refused to let violence masquerade as virtue. What happened in that courtroom on April 14, 1832, would set in motion a series of events that would eventually force a community to confront what it had chosen not to see, and would establish practices that, while never codified into law, would change how consent was verified in St. Martin Parish for generations to come. To understand how a father could legally sell his daughter in an American courtroom in 1832, we must first understand the unique legal landscape of Louisiana in the antebellum period. Louisiana was, and remains, a civil law outlier within the United States. While other states operated under English common law traditions, Louisiana's legal system derived from French and Spanish colonial codes, creating a framework fundamentally different from its neighboring states. Under the Louisiana Civil Code of 1825, which was in full force at the time of Evangeline's case, paternal authority was expansive in ways that would have been unusual even in other southern states. The code granted fathers near absolute power over their minor children, particularly daughters. Guardianship and tutorship provisions intersected directly with property law, creating a legal architecture in which children, especially daughters, existed in a space somewhere between persons and assets. What the code called marriage portions, or dowries, moved through the same ledgers, contracts, and accounting systems as land deeds, livestock inventories, and bills of sale for enslaved people. The economic context of 1830s Louisiana cannot be separated from its legal peculiarities. Sugar prices in this period were notoriously volatile, subject to international market fluctuations, Caribbean competition, and the unpredictable nature of Louisiana's climate. Planters operated on credit extended by New Orleans factors, financial intermediaries who advanced funds against future crops, purchased supplies, and essentially controlled the cash flow of plantation operations. A single bad harvest, a drop in sugar prices, or an unexpected expense could destabilize even seemingly prosperous plantations. In this precarious financial ecosystem, planters leveraged everything available to them: land, enslaved labor, future crops, and increasingly their daughters' futures. In the parishes along Bayou Teche, where the Boudreau plantation was located, The machinery of daily life braided domestic arrangements with commercial exchange in ways that contemporary observers found unremarkable. Church registers recorded baptisms alongside property transfers. Notaries' offices handled marriage contracts with the same procedural formality as sheriff's sales of foreclosed property. The line between family and finance was not simply blurred, it was deliberately erased, creating a system in which a daughter's marriage could function as a debt instrument, a credit arrangement, or a property transfer depending on the economic needs of her father. The Boudreaux plantation itself exemplified both the prosperity and the precariousness of this system. Property records show the estate consisted of approximately 200 arpents under sugar cane cultivation, an arpent being the French measurement still used in Louisiana, roughly equivalent to 0.85 acres. The plantation's labor force included 59 enslaved people, according to the 1830 parish census. The main house, described in various documents as a double-gallery house, featuring the raised Creole architecture typical of the region, was relatively new, having been completed in 1828 at considerable expense. On paper, the Boudreaux estate was solvent. Crop yields were adequate, the enslaved workforce was stable, and the property itself was valuable. But solvent in 1832 Louisiana did not mean secure. Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux carried debts to at least 3 New Orleans factors, owed back wages to an overseer, and had recently purchased additional enslaved laborers on credit to expand his sugar works. His financial position was stable only so long as sugar prices remained favorable and his creditors remained patient. When those conditions shifted, Jean-Baptiste required a solution, one that adopted the era's vocabulary of respectability while functioning as a pure financial transaction. His solution was to repackage what was essentially an auction of his daughter as a marriage arrangement, using the legal instruments available under Louisiana Civil Code to make private economic calculation appear as family alliance. This was the machinery into which Evangeline Boudreaux was inserted on April 14, 1832, a legal system that granted her father nearly unlimited authority over her person and her future, combined with an economic system that incentivized treating daughters as negotiable assets. What made her case distinctive was not that it was unique. Similar arrangements occurred with disturbing regularity across Plantation, Louisiana, but that it was eventually documented, challenged, and preserved in sufficient detail for later generations to reconstruct exactly how a courthouse could become a marketplace, and how a father's signature could transform into a bill of sale. The Evangeline Boudreaux case remained hidden for nearly a century, buried in the routine administrative debris of parish governance. The story of how it came to light reveals the painstaking detective work required to excavate uncomfortable truths from archives designed, whether intentionally or not, to obscure them. In 1931, archivist Claire Mouton was conducting a systematic cataloging project of St. Martin Parish notarial volumes housed in the parish courthouse. Mouton, a graduate of the Louisiana State Normal School and one of the few professionally trained archivists working in rural Louisiana parishes at that time, had been hired under a Works Progress Administration grant to organize and index documents dating back to Louisiana's territorial period. The work was methodical and often tedious, recording dates, parties, transaction types, and cross-references for thousands of contracts, property transfers, and estate settlements. It was during this cataloging work that Mouton encountered an anomaly. A notarial entry from April 14, 1832, recorded a marriage conveyance for Evangeline Boudreaux, a standard enough document type. But attached to the file was something unusual, a cross-reference to a private letter, not part of the official notarial record, that had apparently been preserved accidentally when papers were bound together. The letter, written in educated French, was brief and cryptic. Child promised and placed as discussed. Term satisfactory. JPB. The initials matched Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux. The phrasing, promised and placed, was commercial language, the terminology of contracts and commodities, not family. Mouton flagged the entry and began pulling related documents. The same week, while examining financial records from the same period, she discovered a bill of exchange dated April 20, 1832, 6 days after the marriage conveyance. The bill documented a debt remission. Merchant broker Alphonse Girard, the groom in the marriage conveyance, was releasing Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux from a debt obligation of 3,000 piastres. The timing was suggestive but not conclusive. Debt forgiveness between commercial partners was common. What made this entry significant was the notation in the margin, in a different hand, marriage portion, Boudreaux E. The third and most revealing discovery came from an entirely different source. Mouton had begun consulting with local historians and descendants of the parish's free people of color, recognizing that official archives often omitted crucial perspectives. Through these contacts, she was directed to a cache of private ledgers maintained by Madame Heloise Duret, a free woman of color who had worked as a midwife in St. Martin Parish from approximately 1820 until her death in 1851. These ledgers, preserved by Duret's descendants, recorded births, illnesses, and medical consultations in meticulous detail, a parallel archive maintained outside official channels because free women of color, despite their medical expertise, were not permitted to file formal reports with parish authorities. In Duret's ledger for April 1832, Mouton found an entry dated April 13, one day before the courthouse transaction. The entry was brief but devastating in its implications. Attended Boudreau property. Girl, 16 years, frightened, unable to speak clearly. Father present throughout consultation. Prescribed tonics. Payment received. Below this, in what appeared to be a later edition, Duret had written, "The girl wept without sound. This was not consent. This was commerce." Piece together these three sources, the cross-referenced letter, the debt remission, and the midwife's ledger, traced the outline of a transaction that the official record had been designed to hide. They documented the day that a plantation parlor became a marketplace, the moment when a father's authority and a legal system's machinery combined to transform a teenage girl into a negotiable instrument. What Mouton had discovered was not simply a case of arranged marriage common enough in the period, but evidence of a calculated sale masked by the language of respectability and legitimized by institutional authority. Her discovery reopened questions that St. Martin Parish had buried beneath a century of sugar wealth, political prominence, and Sunday sermons. How had a courthouse made a family transaction appear lawful? How had witnesses signed documents without apparent objection? How had a community that prided itself on Catholic virtue and Creole refinement allowed a 16-year-old to be sold in plain sight? And perhaps most importantly, how had silence been maintained so effectively that it took a century and a WPA archivist to bring the truth into daylight? Mouton's findings, published initially in a limited circulation academic journal in 1932, attracted little attention at the time. The Boudreau family name still carried weight in Louisiana politics, and there was limited appetite for revisiting uncomfortable aspects of antebellum social arrangements. But the documentation she preserved, copies of the original ledgers, transcriptions of the marginalia, and her own careful analysis, would become the foundation for a fuller understanding of how Louisiana's unique legal system could be weaponized by those with authority against those with none. Understanding Jean-Baptiste Boudreau's actions on April 14, 1832, requires examining the family's history and the domestic regime he constructed within his household. The patterns of control that enabled Evangeline's sale were not spontaneous but carefully cultivated across years, built on a foundation of paternal authority, social isolation, and a family culture that treated daughters as instruments of consolidation rather than individuals with autonomous futures. The Boudreau family arrived in Louisiana as refugees from the Haitian Revolution, then called Saint-Domingue, in 1804, part of the massive wave of French planters, free people of color, and enslaved individuals who fled the revolutionary violence. The family brought with them cash reserves, 2 enslaved families, and something less tangible but equally significant, a particular theology of bloodlines and racial hierarchy that had governed plantation society in the Caribbean. This worldview, common among Saint-Domingue refugees, held that family purity and economic power were inseparable, that bloodlines must be protected and strategically deployed, and that paternal authority was not simply a legal right but a sacred duty. Jean-Baptiste inherited the Boudreau plantation in 1820 upon his father's death. With the property came a well-established grammar of dominance. Paternal rights were understood as property rights, daughters were viewed as instruments for creating alliances and consolidating holdings, and family honor was measured in the ability to control one's household absolutely. Parish baptism records from the 1820s and early 1830s reveal a telling pattern in how the Boudreau children were raised. Sons, Jean-Baptiste had 3, were sent to New Orleans for education, appearing in the enrollment records of merchant academies and, in one case, a legal apprenticeship. They moved freely, traveled to Mobile and Natchez, and were being prepared for public roles as planters and commercial actors. Daughters received drastically different treatment. Parish records show that the Boudreau daughters, Evangeline and her 2 younger sisters, were educated at home by a succession of governesses, none of whom remained in the household more than 18 months. They did not attend the parish school operated by the Ursuline sisters, despite the family's prominent Catholic identity. They appeared rarely at church functions beyond mandatory. Massachusetts witnesses later testified that the Boudreau daughters were kept, in the phrase that appeared repeatedly in various accounts, within sight, meaning within the physical boundaries of the plantation, under direct supervision, and isolated from the social networks through which most planter daughters formed friendships, learned social norms, and crucially, developed the connections that might offer refuge or intervention. The trajectory of control intensified after a pivotal event, the death of Evangeline's mother, Marie-Therese Boudreau, née Dupré, in 1825. Marie-Therese died of yellow fever when Evangeline was 9 years old. In many planter families, a mother's death would result in daughters being sent to live with female relatives or placed in convent schools. Jean-Baptiste chose neither option. Instead, guardianship records filed in St. Martin Parish in late 1825 list him alone as tutor and administrator of the minor's interest, legal language granting him exclusive authority over Evangeline's person, property, and future. Louisiana law typically required oversight from maternal relatives or the appointment of a co-tutor in cases of paternal authority over female minors. Jean-Baptiste successfully petitioned to waive these safeguards, arguing that as a man of property and standing, his sole authority was sufficient and that dividing guardianship would create unnecessary complications in household management. With exclusive guardianship secured, Jean-Baptiste's control over Evangeline intensified. Household accounts preserved in the Boudreau papers reveal purchases that, read in sequence, appear to document preparation for an outcome already decided years in advance. Beginning in 1829, when Evangeline was 13, the accounts show purchases of linen, lace, and what are described as bridal gloves, items associated with trousseau preparation. A plantation carpenter was paid for installing additional security on what household inventories identify as the daughter's quarters. Hardware bills include payment for a lock described as heavy-gauge interior mounting, meaning a lock installed on the outside of a door, designed not to keep intruders out but to keep occupants in. Former enslaved individuals who worked in the Boudreau household, interviewed decades later by WPA workers collecting oral histories, corroborated what the paper trail suggested. They described a domestic environment calibrated to prevent choice while creating the appearance of normalcy. Evangeline and her sisters ate at different times than their father and brothers. They were prohibited from entering the plantation office where business was conducted. They were not permitted to walk the plantation grounds without an escort, always a house servant answerable directly to Jean-Baptiste. One elderly woman, identified in WPA transcripts only as Miriam, formerly of the Boudreau place, described the atmosphere in stark terms. That house was a jail dressed up like a home. Master made sure those girls knew they belonged to him same as we did, just with better clothes and prettier chains. The investigation into the Boudreau household revealed a domestic regime constructed with remarkable deliberation. It was designed to isolate, to limit information, to prevent the formation of independent relationships, and to normalize absolute paternal control. By the time Evangeline turned 16 in 1831, she had been shaped by years of systemic isolation and control. She had no independent social connections, no access to family members who might advocate for her, and no framework for understanding that what her father was preparing was not normal, not acceptable, and not inevitable. The groundwork for her sale had been laid methodically year after year, in a household where paternal authority functioned as absolute dominion and where the language of care masked the reality of captivity. While Louisiana in 1832 produced meticulous documentation of commercial transactions, property transfers, and legal proceedings, medical records in the modern sense barely existed. Physicians rarely maintained detailed patient files, and when they did, privacy concerns and professional discretion meant such documents were not preserved in public archives. However, the absence of formal medical records does not mean the absence of medical evidence. The Evangeline Boudreau case demonstrates how fragments scattered across church records, private ledgers, and informal notations can be pieced together to reveal patterns of coercion and trauma that the official legal record was designed to hide. The St. Martin Parish Catholic Church maintained detailed registers of baptisms, confirmations, marriages, and deaths, as required by both ecclesiastical law and Louisiana civil law, which recognized church records as official documentation. These registers also included notations about confirmation classes, confession schedules, and attendance at required religious instruction. For Evangeline Boudreau, these records reveal a troubling pattern in the weeks immediately preceding her marriage conveyance. The Cure's attendance book for March 1832 marks Evangeline as present for confirmation class every Sunday through March 4th. Beginning March 11th, her name carries the notation, absent, ill. This absence designation continues for 3 consecutive weeks, through April 1st. No other details are provided in the church record, but the timing is significant. The marriage conveyance occurred on April 14, just 2 weeks after Evangeline's return to church activities. The period of absence, 3 weeks in which a 16-year-old was kept away from the one public activity she was regularly permitted to attend, corresponds exactly with what later evidence suggests was the period of negotiation and preparation for the transaction. The most revealing medical documentation comes from the ledgers of Madame Heloise Duret, the free woman of color who worked as a midwife and informal physician for both enslaved and free women in St. Martin Parish. Duret's practice served patients whom mainstream white physicians often refused to treat or whom families preferred to keep away from public scrutiny. Her ledgers, maintained in French with occasional Creole phrasing, provide a parallel medical record more detailed and more honest than anything that appears in official archives. Duret's entry for April 13, 1832, the day before the courthouse ceremony, describes attending to Evangeline at the Boudreaux plantation. Her clinical observations are coded in the medical language of the period but are nonetheless revealing. She notes bruising to the upper arms, consistent with restraint, phrasing that indicates she observed injury patterns suggesting the girl had been forcibly held or grabbed. She describes symptoms she terms hysteria, the 19th century medical catch-all for what we would now recognize as acute psychological trauma. Sleeplessness, tremors, difficulty speaking, and what Duret describes as aphonia, the inability to produce vocal sound despite having no physical injury to the throat. Duret prescribed tonics for nerves, and her ledger notes payment received directly from Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux. The prescription she refers to was almost certainly laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that was the standard treatment in this period for any condition involving agitation, sleeplessness, or emotional distress. Laudanum was freely available, widely prescribed, and routinely used to sedate patients, particularly female patients, whose emotional responses were deemed inconvenient or excessive by their male guardians. What makes Duret's account particularly significant is what she added to the entry later, apparently after learning what had transpired at the courthouse the following day. Below her clinical notes, in a different ink suggesting it was written at a different time, she added, "The girl wept without sound. Father remained present throughout the consultation, answering all questions directed to her. This was not illness. This was terror. I treated symptoms I could not name and witnessed coercion I could not prevent." A second medical fragment appears in the papers of Dr. Auguste Perrin, a white physician based in New Iberia who maintained a limited practice among planter families. Perrin's account book for April 1832 includes an entry, consultation and tonic, Boudreaux household, nervous condition, payment received. The amount listed, $15, substantial for the period, suggests an extended consultation. More revealing is a separate memorandum found in Perrin's papers, apparently a personal note. The father insists the girl is merely temperamental and will settle once married. I observed symptoms suggesting severe distress but was not permitted to speak with the patient alone. My professional opinion was not sought regarding fitness for marriage, only for a prescription to manage agitation. I complied but with misgivings. These medical fragments, read together, outline a body speaking truths that the legal system refused to hear. Evangeline's symptoms, the inability to speak, the tremors, the bruising, the profound distress, constituted what medical professionals today would immediately recognize as indicators of coercion and acute trauma. But in 1832, medical practice was governed by assumptions that pathologized female resistance and normalized male authority. Women who resisted patriarchal decisions were categorized as hysterical, irrational, or temperamental. Their distress was treated as a medical problem to be managed with sedation rather than as evidence of coercion to be investigated and prevented. The Church's role in this system was equally troubling. Canon law theoretically required that both parties to a marriage freely consent and that priests verify this consent through private consultation. However, in practice, Church authorities in Plantation, Louisiana deferred heavily to paternal authority. The St. Martin Parish Church records show that marriage dispensations were routinely granted for urgency, a category that allowed abbreviated bans and reduced inquiry into the circumstances. For Evangeline's marriage, such a dispensation was granted based solely on an affidavit from Jean-Baptiste affirming his daughter's consent. The priest never spoke with Evangeline alone, never questioned why a 16-year-old marked as ill for 3 weeks was suddenly well enough to marry, and never investigated why a marriage conveyance was being expedited with such haste. Medical and religious institutions that might have served as safeguards instead became enablers. The medical professionals treated symptoms without addressing causes, sedated distress without examining its sources, and accepted payment from the very person orchestrating the coercion. The Church accepted paternal attestations without verification and granted dispensations that eliminated the waiting periods during which intervention might have occurred. These institutional failures transformed what should have been safeguards into mechanisms that smoothed the path from parlor to courthouse, making resistance appear as illness and coercion appear as care. The document signed on April 14, 1832, is a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, a text that demonstrates how violence can be laundered through bureaucratic language and how institutions can transform coercion into something that looks, on paper, like legitimate exchange. Understanding the mechanisms through which Evangeline Boudreau was sold requires examining not just what the document said, but what it carefully avoided saying, and how the courthouse ceremony functioned as theater designed to make private harm appear as public order. The marriage conveyance, preserved in the St. Martin Parish Notarial Archives, runs to 4 pages of dense legal French written in the standardized format required by Louisiana Civil Code. On its surface, the document appears as a routine dowry arrangement, a marriage portion, of the type registered hundreds of times each year across Louisiana parishes. The conveyance lists Evangeline's dowry as consisting of household linens valued at $400, silverware valued at $200, and a promissory note for $2,400, a total of $3,000, rendered in the document as 3,000 piastres, using the Spanish currency designation still common in Louisiana commerce. What makes this document distinctive is the creative accounting underlying it. Rather than representing property Jean-Baptiste was giving to his daughter for her new household, the dowry was structured as repayment of debt, specifically, debt that Evangeline allegedly owed her father. The language is precise, in satisfaction of maintenance, education and care provided since infancy, valued at 3,000 piastres, now due and payable. In this formulation, Jean-Baptiste had monetized every aspect of paternal care retroactively, assigning dollar values to the food, shelter, clothing and education he had provided his daughter over 16 years, and declaring these expenditures to be a loan that could now be called due. This accounting fiction transformed Evangeline from daughter to debtor and Jean-Baptiste from father to creditor. Under Louisiana Civil Code, a creditor had extensive rights to collect debts through property transfer, and guardians had broad authority to manage the finances of their minor children. By restructuring the transaction as debt settlement, Jean-Baptiste created a legal framework in which he was not giving his daughter away but merely collecting what was owed to him, with Evangeline's person serving as the collateral that made the debt negotiable. The groom, Alphonse Girard, occupied a specific role in this arrangement. Girard was not a planter but a merchant broker, what period documents describe as a factor's agent. An intermediary who arranged credit, purchased goods, and managed financial instruments on behalf of New Orleans factors and their planter clients. Girard's relationship with Jean-Baptiste was purely commercial. He held several of the Boudreau plantation's debt obligations, having purchased them at discount from original creditors. The marriage conveyance functioned as a mechanism to extinguish these debts. By accepting Evangeline as his wife along with her $3,000 dowry, Girard was effectively forgiving an equivalent amount of debt that Jean-Baptiste owed him. The auction nature of the transaction emerged not in the written document but in the ceremony itself, in the performative aspects of how the conveyance was executed. Witnesses who were present later described the scene in depositions taken during the ecclesiastical inquiry of 1833. The proceeding took place in the parish notary's office, a room described as small, poorly ventilated, and crowded with approximately 8 men. Jean-Baptiste, Alphonse Girard, Judge Delisle, the notary Claude Arsenault, and 4 witnesses required by law to validate the transaction. Evangeline was present but peripheral. She sat in a chair positioned against the wall, her father standing immediately behind her with his hand resting on the chair's back. The notary read the terms of the conveyance aloud as required by law, but he directed his recitation to the men in the room, not to Evangeline. The reading lasted approximately 15 minutes. When the notary reached the provisions of the dowry, the itemization of linens, silver, and the promissory note, witnesses recalled that Girard and Jean-Baptiste exchanged glances, and Girard stated clearly, "I accept the terms as satisfaction of the debt." This phrase, "I accept the terms," was the bid though no one called it that. The transaction had been structured so that only one potential groom was present, but the mechanism was identical to an auction. Terms were announced, a price was stated, and acceptance was given. The presence of the judge and multiple witnesses, the formal reading, the signing and sealing, all of this ritual transformed what was essentially a private deal between creditor and debtor into something that appeared to be public, legitimate, and irreversible. Evangeline's participation in the ceremony consisted of a single scripted line. After the terms were read and Gerard had accepted, the notary turned to her and asked, as required by civil and canon law, "Do you consent to this marriage?" Witnesses agreed on what happened next. Evangeline began to speak, stopped, looked toward her father, and then said in what one witness described as a voice barely audible, the required words, "I consent." The scene these witnesses described was pure theater, a performance in which every element was choreographed to produce the appearance of legality while obscuring the coercion underneath. Evangeline's consent was elicited with her father's hand upon her chair, his physical presence a reminder of his authority and an implicit threat of what would occur if she deviated from the script. The audience of male witnesses, all of them socially and economically connected to Jean-Baptiste, all of them dependent in various ways on maintaining good relations with a prominent planter, watched, nodded, and signed the document affirming that they had witnessed free consent and legitimate exchange. Judge Delisle's signature on the document carried particular weight. As parish judge, Delisle was not merely a witness but the official who gave the transaction legal force. His participation signaled that the parish's judicial authority approved and legitimized what was occurring. The courthouse had become a marketplace, and the judge's signature was the seal of quality guaranteeing the transaction's validity. The investigation into this case revealed how ritual, ink, seals, oaths, and officially stamped paper can make private harm appear as public order. Plantation custom had turned violence into ceremony, and Louisiana's legal machinery provided the instruments through which a father could sell his daughter while appearing to arrange her marriage, through which a man could purchase a wife while appearing to settle a debt, and through which a teenager's terror could be recorded in official archives as consent duly affirmed. In cases of systemic coercion backed by legal authority and social power, formal resistance is often impossible. When the law itself sanctions the harm, when institutional structures from courts to churches enable rather than prevent abuse, and when victims are deliberately isolated from anyone who might intervene, the possibilities for open defiance collapse. But the absence of formal resistance does not mean the absence of resistance entirely. The Evangeline Boudreau case demonstrates how those without power create alternate forms of opposition. Small acts of witness, preservation, and connection that operate below the threshold of what authorities can suppress but that ultimately prove decisive in establishing truth and enabling intervention. Survivor testimony from 1832 rarely appears in official archives. Enslaved people, free people of color, and white women all occupied positions in Louisiana's social hierarchy that made their testimony legally suspect or entirely inadmissible in courts. But gestures survive, objects carry meaning, and memory preserves what documents exclude. The recovery of resistance in Evangeline's case required examining sources that traditional historical method might dismiss. Oral histories collected a century later, material objects preserved by families outside the official record, and the informal networks through which information circulated when formal channels were closed. The smuggled rosary cross emerged as a central artifact in reconstructing what occurred. The object itself is small, a simple wooden cross approximately 2 inches in length, attached to what remains of a ribbon that witness accounts identify as having been blue silk. The cross was kept by a woman named Miriam, who was enslaved in the Boudreau household and was approximately 14 years old in 1832. Miriam kept the cross for more than 30 years, until emancipation and beyond, and the object eventually passed to her descendants. When WPA oral historians interviewed Miriam's granddaughter in 1936, the cross was still in the family's possession, and the story of its origin had been carefully preserved. According to the account given to WPA interviewers, the cross had belonged to Evangeline and had been given to her at her first communion. On the morning of April 14, 1832, as Evangeline was being prepared for the courthouse ceremony, Miriam was assigned to help dress her. At some point during this preparation, accounts suggest it was while Evangeline's hair was being arranged, the cross was pressed into Miriam's hand. No words were exchanged, Jean-Baptiste or other household members were present throughout. But the gesture itself was clear. Evangeline was giving away something precious, something associated with her religious identity and her own agency, to someone she trusted to remember. Attached to the cross was a scrap of ribbon, not the full length but a piece that appeared to have been cut or torn. The ribbon, according to Miriam's testimony, had been part of a hair ribbon Evangeline wore. The act of cutting it, risky as any alteration to Evangeline's appearance might be noticed and questioned, and attaching it to the cross created an object that combined religious significance with personal connection. It was evidence, however small, that what was happening was wrong, that the girl being taken to the courthouse understood she was being taken against her will, and that she was creating a witness to her resistance even if she could not resist openly. The second element of resistance documented in witness accounts was a phrase, 3 words that Evangeline reportedly repeated to anyone who would meet her eyes during the preparation and journey to the courthouse. Count the days. Kitchen workers, house servants, and later the carriage driver all recalled hearing these words. The phrase carried multiple meanings. On one level, it was a plea to remember, to mark the date, to note what was happening, to preserve the memory of this coercion so it could not be erased or reimagined as willing participation. On another level, it suggested Evangeline's own understanding that this situation was not permanent, that days could be counted until something changed, until intervention became possible or until she could act on her own behalf. The whisper network that formed around Evangeline operated across lines of race, status, and legal authority in ways that were both remarkable and dangerous for all involved. Free women of color, enslaved women, and a small number of white women who occupied marginal positions in planter society created an informal coalition of witness and small intervention. These women could not stop the courthouse ceremony, they had no legal standing to challenge a father's guardianship or a judge's decision, but they could refuse to bless it, and they could position themselves to help when opportunity arose. Madame Heloise Duret, the midwife, played a central role in this network. After her consultation with Evangeline on April 13, Duret appears to have made a deliberate decision to document what she had observed and to remain alert for any opportunity to intervene. Her ledger entries became more detailed and she began making copies, an unusual practice that suggests she anticipated these records might be needed. She also began speaking carefully with other women in her network, free women of color who worked as laundresses, seamstresses, and domestic servants in planter households. The information she shared was factual and clinical. A 16-year-old girl showing signs of severe distress, a father exercising absolute control, a marriage being expedited without the girl's free participation. One member of this network was a laundress named Celeste who worked for multiple planter families, including the Boudreau household. In the days following the courthouse ceremony, Celeste deliberately delayed completing Evangeline's trousseau, the clothing and linens being prepared for her new household with Gerard. Each delay, though small, postponed the transfer of Evangeline from her father's house to her husband's. When questioned about the delays, Celeste cited problems with fabric quality, difficulties with stitching, and the need to redo work that didn't meet standards. These excuses were plausible enough that she was not punished, but the pattern was clear to those watching. She was buying time. Another woman, identified in records only as Widow Landry, lived on a small property adjacent to the route between the Boudreau plantation and the town where Gerard maintained a residence. On the night of April 14th and for several nights afterward, witnesses reported that a lamp remained lit in Widow Landry's window facing the road, an unusual practice as lamp oil was expensive and most households extinguished lights after dark. The lit window functioned as a signal. A safe house was available, a place where someone fleeing could find refuge. Evangeline never reached that window in those early days, but the lamp remained lit, a beacon indicating that not everyone in the community had accepted what occurred in the courthouse as legitimate or final. The network's most significant act of resistance was the preservation of witness. Each woman who saw what was happening, who heard Evangeline's phrase, "Count the days," who noted the girl's distress and the father's control, became a repository of evidence that contradicted the official story. When formal investigation finally became possible months later, it was these women, Duret, Celeste, Widow Landry, Miriam, and others whose names appear fragmentarily in various records, who provided the testimony that made intervention legally viable. Their resistance operated at the threshold of what was possible. They could not directly challenge paternal authority or judicial decisions. They could not file legal complaints or initiate investigations. But they could watch, remember, document in informal ways, and position themselves to help when the opportunity arose. They could refuse to participate in the collective fiction that what had happened in the courthouse was a wedding rather than a sale. And they could maintain connections with each other, creating a network of mutual support and shared knowledge that operated outside official channels but proved essential when those channels finally opened. The story of the smuggled cross and the whisper network reveals a form of resistance that historians have often missed because it left few traces in official records. But the absence of formal documentation does not indicate the absence of resistance. It indicates instead the creativity and courage of people who found ways to oppose violence even when every institution was arrayed against them, who preserved truth even when power tried to bury it, and who kept watch even when they could not yet act. None of these women could stop the contract on April 14, 1832, but all of them refused to bless it, and that refusal created the conditions that would eventually make rescue possible. Formal intervention in the Evangeline Boudreau case arrived slowly, haltingly, and through channels that revealed as much about the limitations of legal protection as about its possibilities. The story of how official authorities finally became involved demonstrates the distance between what legal systems claim to protect and what they actually protect in practice, particularly when victims are young, female, and under the authority of powerful men. The first official notice of trouble appears in St. Martin Parish Sheriff's records in May 1832, approximately 1 month after the courthouse ceremony. The entry, dated May 9, is brief and procedurally vague. Disturbances reported at the Boudreau property. Deputy dispatched. Parties counseled. No arrest warranted. This single line in the sheriff's log reveals virtually nothing about what actually occurred, but when cross-referenced with other sources, it begins to tell a story. Witness accounts collected later suggest that the disturbances involved Evangeline's attempts to leave the Boudreau plantation without permission and her father's forcible prevention of her departure. Specifically, multiple sources indicate that Evangeline was attempting to visit her mother's grave, located in the parish cemetery approximately 3 miles from the plantation. Under Louisiana law and custom, a married woman required her husband's permission to leave her residence, but the question of where Evangeline actually resided was ambiguous. Though married to Alphonse Girard on paper, she had not yet been transferred to his household. She remained physically at her father's plantation, in a legal and domestic limbo that gave Jean-Baptiste continued control while shielding Girard from the complications of a visibly unwilling wife. When Evangeline attempted to leave, accounts suggest she left on foot in early morning heading toward the cemetery. Jean-Baptiste had her forcibly returned. Neighbors heard shouting. Someone, likely a concerned neighbor or a person traveling the road, reported the incident to the sheriff. But when a deputy arrived to investigate, he encountered a situation that the legal framework of 1832 Louisiana was poorly equipped to address. A father claimed he was protecting his daughter from her own reckless behavior. The daughter, when questioned in her father's presence, said little or nothing. There was no evidence of injury that the deputy could see or that anyone was willing to document. And critically, Jean-Baptiste was a prominent planter with political connections, while the daughter was a minor with no independent legal standing. The deputy's decision, parties counseled, no arrest warranted, reflected the practical reality that sheriffs in plantation parishes were deeply embedded in the social and economic networks they policed. Arresting a major planter on the word of his own daughter, in a dispute that appeared on its surface to be a domestic matter involving parental authority, would have required both legal justification and political courage. The deputy had neither. He counseled, meaning he likely told Jean-Baptiste to handle his household matters more quietly, and he left. The official response to Evangeline's attempted escape was to reinforce her father's authority to confine her. The civil legal system offered Evangeline virtually no recourse. Louisiana Civil Code granted married women few independent rights. A married woman could not file legal complaints without her husband's consent, could not control her own property, and could not testify against her husband in most contexts. Evangeline was in an even more complicated position. Married on paper but not living with her husband, still under her father's physical control, with both men having legal claims to authority over her. The civil courts, even if she could have accessed them, provided no clear path to challenge the marriage conveyance or to escape either man's control. The ecclesiastical inquiry that eventually developed represented the only legal channel through which Evangeline's situation could be formally investigated. Canon law, the legal system governing the Catholic Church, had always maintained that coerced marriages were invalid, that free consent was essential, and that the Church had an obligation to investigate cases where consent was questionable. Unlike civil law, canon law allowed for testimony from the parties themselves and did not automatically subordinate a woman's testimony to male authority. The inquiry appears to have been initiated through unofficial channels. Sister Ursule, a lay nurse associated with the parish church who would later play a crucial role in Evangeline's eventual escape, seems to have raised concerns with the parish priest, Father Armand Broussard. Sister Ursule had heard about the April courthouse ceremony through the network of women who had been watching the situation, and she had received information from Madame Duret about Evangeline's condition before the wedding. Based on these concerns, she pressed Father Broussard to exercise his canonical authority to investigate whether the marriage had been freely contracted. Father Broussard, to his credit, initiated a formal inquiry in June 1832, approximately 2 months after the ceremony. The inquiry followed established ecclesiastical procedure: written notices to the parties, appointment of a notary to record testimony, and a schedule of interviews to be conducted under oath. The Vicar General of the diocese, Monsignor Auguste Blanc, was notified and assigned to oversee the inquiry, giving it official weight. The inquiry began with questioning the notary who had recorded the marriage conveyance. Claude Arsenault testified that all legal requirements had been met, that the bride had stated her consent clearly, and that he had observed no signs of coercion. When pressed on whether he had spoken with Evangeline privately, separate from her father's presence, he acknowledged he had not, stating that such private consultation was not required by civil law and that the father's presence was appropriate given the bride's age and unmarried status at the time. Alphonse Girard, the groom, was questioned next. His testimony was carefully constructed to present the arrangement as a legitimate business transaction that happened to involve marriage. He acknowledged that he had held debt obligations from Jean-Baptiste Boudreau. He confirmed that the marriage conveyance had extinguished these debts. But he characterized this as a normal dowry arrangement, arguing that it was customary for brides to bring financial settlements that benefited their new husbands. When asked whether he had courted Evangeline or established any personal relationship with her before the marriage, he stated that such courtship was unnecessary in arranged marriages and that his relationship with her father had been sufficient foundation for the alliance. The inquiry then attempted to question Jean-Baptiste Boudreau. Multiple summons were issued, requiring his appearance to provide testimony. He ignored all of them. In a move that revealed his understanding of his own power and the inquiry's limitations, Jean-Baptiste simply refused to participate. He sent no explanations, no legal representation, no communication whatsoever. He appears to have calculated, correctly, that an ecclesiastical inquiry had no meaningful power to compel a prominent planter's cooperation, particularly when that planter had political allies and economic leverage throughout the parish. The inquiry's greatest challenge was obtaining testimony from Evangeline herself. Canon law required that her testimony be taken, but the practical difficulties were enormous. She remained at the Boudreau plantation under her father's physical control. She was legally married to Girard, meaning her husband's permission was technically required for her to testify. And any testimony taken at the plantation in her father's house would be inherently compromised by his presence and power. Father Broussard attempted to arrange for Evangeline to be brought to the church rectory for private questioning. Jean-Baptiste refused to allow it. The ecclesiastical court then proposed that testimony be taken at the Boudreau plantation with only church officials present. Again, Jean-Baptiste refused, stating that his daughter was unwell and not fit for questioning. When the Vicar General threatened canonical penalties, potentially excommunication, for obstruction of a church inquiry, Jean-Baptiste's response was telling. He simply stopped responding to communications altogether. The inquiry eventually obtained one brief statement from Evangeline, taken at the plantation with her father present throughout. The transcript records her testimony as consisting of 3 sentences. I am married to Alphonse Girard. The marriage was conducted according to law. I have no complaint to make. The notary recording this testimony added a marginal note. Witness appeared distressed and spoke in a manner suggesting rehearsal. Father answered several questions directed to witness before she could respond. With this compromised testimony, with Jean-Baptiste's refusal to cooperate, and with no clear evidence that civil law had been violated, the ecclesiastical inquiry reached the limits of what it could accomplish. The Vicar General's report, filed in August 1832, acknowledged the troubling circumstances but concluded that intervention was not canonically justified based on the evidence the inquiry had been able to gather. The final line of the report reads, "Cause deferred for want of proof sufficient to invalidate a marriage contracted with apparent legal compliance. Matter to be revisited should additional evidence emerge or circumstances change." The inquiry had failed, but not because church officials were indifferent. It failed because the system was designed to favor paternal authority, to treat women's testimony as inherently suspect when it conflicted with male authority, and to require levels of proof that were effectively impossible to obtain when the victim was physically controlled by those accused of coercion. The paper trail of the inquiry, the summons Jean-Baptiste ignored, the compromised testimony, the frustrated notes from ecclesiastical officials, documented the distance between stated legal protections and actual legal power. The system was meticulous in recording property transactions but proved imprecise, even helpless, when asked to record and remedy pain. The ecclesiastical inquiry's failure in August 1832 left Evangeline in a precarious position. She remained at the Boudreau plantation, married on paper to a man she barely knew, under the physical control of the father who had sold her, and with no apparent legal recourse. The months that followed demonstrated both the depths of her vulnerability and the persistence of those who refused to abandon her case. By late fall of 1832, Evangeline was pregnant. Medical records from Madame Duret's ledger note visits to the Boudreau plantation in October and November, describing what Duret termed difficult pregnancy, complicated by the mother's distressed state. Her entries grew increasingly alarmed. Patient exhibits persistent bleeding, insufficient rest, signs of declining health. In one particularly revealing entry from early December, Duret wrote, "I fear for both mother and child. The girl's physical condition reflects her mental state. She is being consumed by circumstances no body can sustain indefinitely." The pregnancy complicated Evangeline's already constrained situation. Under both civil and canon law, a pregnant wife's primary obligation was understood to be protecting the child she carried, which meant remaining under male protection, either her husband's or her father's, and avoiding any action that might be considered reckless or endangering. For Jean-Baptiste and Alphonse Girard, the pregnancy provided additional justification for maintaining control. When Sister Ursule attempted to visit Evangeline in December, ostensibly to provide spiritual counsel, she was turned away with the explanation that the expectant mother needed rest and could not receive visitors. But pregnancy also created new risks that would ultimately provide the opening for intervention. Evangeline's declining health made her dangerous to ignore. If she or the child died under suspicious circumstances, even the tolerant legal environment of Plantation, Louisiana might require investigation. Moreover, the pregnancy forced Alphonse Girard to make a decision he had been avoiding, whether to take Evangeline into his own household or leave her indefinitely at her father's plantation. He chose the former, likely calculating that the appearance of normal marital domesticity would reduce scrutiny. The planned transfer was scheduled for January 1833, after the Epiphany celebrations. But before the transfer could occur, Evangeline made the choice that would change everything. On the evening of January 5, 1833, during the chaos and social activity surrounding the Feast of Epiphany, Evangeline fled. The details of her escape are fragmentary, pieced together from later testimony and the accounts of those who helped. Evangeline left the Boudreau plantation on foot, apparently during the evening meal when household supervision was momentarily relaxed. She was barefoot, whether by choice to move silently, or because she had no opportunity to retrieve shoes is unclear from the surviving accounts. She took nothing with her except the clothes she wore. Her destination was approximately 4 miles away, the cottage of Sister Ursule, located on the river road between the plantation district and the town. Sister Ursule, whose full name was Ursule Doucet, was not a nun in the formal sense but a lay woman who had devoted herself to charitable nursing work, particularly caring for those affected by the cholera epidemics that periodically swept through Louisiana. She operated a small cottage that functioned informally as a clinic and refuge, supported by donations from those she served and by her own modest inheritance. Her position in parish society was marginal but respected. She had no official authority, but her work with the sick gave her a degree of moral standing that even prominent planters were reluctant to challenge directly. Evangeline's appearance at Sister Ursule's cottage that January evening was both a plea for sanctuary and a calculated risk. By fleeing to a religious woman known for charitable work, she was claiming the protection of the church's informal network while avoiding the formal ecclesiastical channels that had already failed her. Sister Ursule's immediate response was to take her in, provide basic care, and send urgent word to the 2 people she believed might be willing and able to help: Madame Heloise Duret, whose medical expertise was immediately necessary, and Julien Arnaud, a Creole attorney whose personal history made him potentially sympathetic. Julien Arnaud's involvement proved decisive. Arnaud was a relatively young attorney, perhaps 30 years old in 1833, who practiced in New Iberia and had a reputation for taking cases other attorneys avoided. His motivation for involving himself in Evangeline's case was intensely personal. His own younger sister had died 2 years earlier in 1831, following what family members believed was a forced marriage arranged by their father to settle debts. The sister had died during childbirth, alone and estranged from most of her family. Arnaud had been unable to help her. When Sister Ursule contacted him about another young woman in similar circumstances, he committed immediately to the case. The coalition that formed in Sister Ursule's cottage in January 1833 represented an alliance across social boundaries that would have been almost unthinkable in ordinary circumstances. Sister Ursule, a white lay religious woman, Madame Duret, a free woman of color and midwife, and Julien Arnaud, a Creole attorney, They had little in common except their determination that what had happened to Evangeline was wrong and their willingness to use what limited tools they had to intervene. Their plan was necessarily legalistic rather than revolutionary. They could not challenge paternal authority directly. Louisiana law was too clear on that point. They could not argue that the marriage was invalid based on coercion. The ecclesiastical inquiry had already attempted and failed on that ground. What they could do was pursue the narrow remedy that Louisiana Civil Code offered for wives in physical danger, separation of bed and board, a legal status short of divorce but allowing a wife to live apart from her husband and control her own property if she could prove excesses and grievous injuries that endangered her life. Arnault spent the next 6 weeks preparing the petition. The document he filed in March 1833 was a masterpiece of strategic legal argumentation. It did not directly accuse Jean-Baptiste Boudreau of selling his daughter. Such an accusation would have been inflammatory and legally difficult to prove. It did not challenge the validity of the marriage itself, which would have required ecclesiastical proceedings. Instead, it focused narrowly on medical facts. Evangeline was pregnant, her health was declining, she had been subject to conditions that endangered both herself and her child, and she required separation from her husband to protect her life. The petition attached affidavits from Madame Duret detailing Evangeline's medical condition and the risks she faced. It included testimony from Sister Ursule describing the state in which Evangeline had arrived at her cottage, barefoot, in distress, and in immediate need of medical care. It referenced, without directly quoting, the findings of the earlier ecclesiastical inquiry that had noted concerning circumstances around the marriage. Most importantly, it focused on the civil law standard for separation, endangerment. Under Louisiana law, a husband's duty to protect his wife was paramount. If that protection failed, the wife had grounds for legal separation. The petition carefully avoided making claims that would require Evangeline to testify in ways that would directly contradict male authority or make her appear to be challenging the social order. Instead, it positioned her as a victim of circumstances, a young woman whose health had been compromised by a hasty marriage and who now required protection that her current domestic situation could not provide. The argument was deeply conservative in many ways. It relied on traditional notions of female vulnerability and male protective obligations, but it was also strategically effective given the legal tools available. The petition for separation of bed and board filed by Julien Arnault on behalf of Evangeline Boudreau arrived on the desk of Parish Judge Etienne Delille in March 1833, placing him in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. This was the same judge who, 11 months earlier, had signed the marriage conveyance that created the situation his court was now being asked to remedy. Delille's signature appeared on the document that had sanctioned what the petition now implicitly characterized as endangerment. He was being asked, in effect, to acknowledge that his own judicial action had contributed to placing a 16-year-old girl in circumstances that threatened her life. The political and social pressures surrounding the case were immense. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau was not merely a prominent planter but a man with extensive connections throughout St. Martin Parish and beyond. He had business relationships with multiple parish officials, social ties to most of the prominent families, and economic leverage through the debts owed to him and the employment he provided. Several members of the parish police jury, the local governing body, had financial dealings with Boudreau. The parish priest had received donations from the Boudreau family for church construction. Challenging Jean-Baptiste meant challenging a pillar of the local establishment. On the other hand, the case had become known throughout the parish, largely through the network of women who had been documenting and discussing it for months. The whisper network that had formed around Evangeline's situation meant that many people, enslaved and free men and women of various social classes, knew the essential facts of what had occurred. The Epiphany flight had made the case even more visible. A pregnant 16-year-old fleeing barefoot to seek sanctuary with a religious woman made for a narrative that was difficult to ignore or reframe as simple domestic discord. Judge Delille scheduled a hearing for March 20, 1833. The courtroom was crowded, with many more observers than typically attended civil proceedings. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau attended with legal counsel, as did Alphonse Girard. Evangeline, still residing at Sister Ursule's cottage, was represented by Julien Arnault. The proceeding lasted most of a day, and while no complete transcript survives, witness accounts and the judge's written ruling provide a reconstruction of what occurred. Arnault's strategy throughout the hearing was to keep the focus relentlessly narrow: his client's physical safety and medical condition. He called Madame Heloise Duret to testify about Evangeline's health, her difficult pregnancy, and the specific medical risks she faced. Duret's testimony, delivered in French with calm professional authority, was devastating in its clinical precision. She described bleeding episodes, dangerous weight loss, symptoms of what we would now recognize as severe depression and trauma, and her professional opinion that continued stress posed immediate risks to both mother and child. Arnaud then called Sister Ursule, who testified about the condition in which Evangeline had arrived at her cottage, barefoot, exhausted, in acute distress. She described the care she had been providing for the past 2 months and her observation that Evangeline's physical and mental health had improved significantly once removed from the circumstances at the Boudreaux plantation. Sister Ursule was careful to frame her testimony in terms of Christian charity and medical necessity rather than accusation, but the implication was clear. The environment Evangeline had been in was making her ill, and separation from it was allowing her to heal. The defense, representing both Jean-Baptiste and Alphonse Girard, attempted to characterize Evangeline as a difficult and temperamental young woman who had manufactured a crisis to avoid her proper duties as wife and daughter. They argued that her pregnancy difficulties were not unusual and did not justify the extraordinary remedy of separation. They suggested that her flight to Sister Ursule's cottage had been manipulated by outside agitators, a clear reference to Arnaud and the women who had been helping Evangeline, who were interfering in legitimate family matters for their own purposes. But the defense faced a fundamental problem. They could not explain why a pregnant 16-year-old would flee barefoot in winter unless she had compelling reason to fear remaining where she was. They could not explain the medical evidence of her declining health. And they could not produce Evangeline herself to testify that she wished to return to her husband or father, because everyone in the courtroom knew that any such testimony would be coerced and therefore meaningless. Judge Delisle took 2 days to issue his ruling. The written decision, preserved in parish court records, is a remarkable document. Remarkable both for what it says and for what it carefully avoids saying. The ruling grants Evangeline separation of bed and board on the grounds that a wife endangered in her person and health shall be secured from further harm, as is the duty of this court under the Civil Code of Louisiana. It orders that Evangeline's dowry, the 3,000 piastres that had been conveyed as part of the marriage arrangement, be returned and placed in usufruct, meaning in trust, with Sister Ursule appointed as guardian ad hoc to manage these funds for Evangeline's benefit. What the ruling does not say is as significant as what it does say. It never mentions Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux's role in arranging the marriage. It does not use the word coercion. It does not characterize the marriage conveyance as a sale or an auction. It makes no finding that the original marriage was improperly contracted. It does not say incest, though the involvement of a father in selling his daughter carried implications that many observers found incestuous in spirit if not in law. The ruling is scrupulously narrow, focusing only on the immediate question before the court. Is this wife in danger? The answer is yes. Therefore, separation is granted. The ruling's carefully limited scope reflected both Judge Delisle's legal constraints and his political calculations. By focusing narrowly on endangerment rather than on how that endangerment came to exist, he could grant relief without directly accusing prominent members of the community or acknowledging his own role in creating the situation. He could position himself as simply applying the law to protect a vulnerable person without making broader claims about systematic failures or institutional complicity. But despite its limitations, the ruling's effects were immediate and real. Evangeline was legally authorized to live apart from Alphonse Girard. She had control of her own financial resources, albeit through a guardian. She had the protection of a court order that Jean-Baptiste could not simply ignore without risking legal consequences. The separation of bed and board was not divorce. Evangeline remained legally married, but it created a protected space in which she could live without being subject to either her husband's or her father's direct physical control. The community response to the ruling divided along predictable lines. Jean-Baptiste and his allies characterized it as a dangerous precedent that undermined paternal authority and encouraged wives to abandon their duties. Notices appeared in the parish, posted at the courthouse and at the church, in which Jean-Baptiste accused agitators and meddlers of theft, framing Evangeline's departure as theft of a daughter's obedience and service, as if these were property rights rather than aspects of a relationship. The language was telling. Even in public protest, he described his daughter in terms of property and obligation rather than care and protection. Others in the community, particularly women and those who had been part of the informal network supporting Evangeline, saw the ruling differently. It confirmed what they had been saying privately for months, that what had happened to Evangeline was wrong, that her flight had been justified, and that she deserved protection. The ruling did not vindicate them completely, it did not acknowledge the sale or name the coercion, but it chose, as one observer later put it, the living over the ledger. Alphonse Girard's response was pragmatic and revealing. Within weeks of the ruling, he negotiated a financial settlement with Julien Arnaud. In exchange for a portion of the dowry funds, Girard agreed not to challenge the separation or attempt to compel Evangeline's return. He then sold his remaining financial interests in St. Martin Parish and left Louisiana entirely, relocating to Galveston, Texas. His departure suggested that his interest in Evangeline had always been purely financial. Once the economic benefit of the marriage evaporated and the social complications mounted, he had no reason to remain. Evangeline moved from Sister Ursule's cottage to a boarding house on Rue Chartres in New Orleans, run by a collective of free women of color who provided housing and support for women in difficult circumstances. There, shielded from easy retrieval by either her father or husband, surrounded by midwives and seamstresses who had experience protecting vulnerable women, she waited for her child to be born. The court had finally acted, but it had acted in the most limited way possible, securing immediate safety without confronting the systems that had created the danger. The ruling never said the word auction, or acknowledged that a courthouse had become a marketplace. But it did say, however narrowly and belatedly, that a wife endangered shall be secured. In a system designed to prioritize male authority and property rights over individual welfare, even that limited acknowledgement represented a small but significant shift, a recognition that law existed not only to record transactions but also to protect persons. Evangeline Boudreau's daughter was born in May 1833 at the boarding house on Rue Chartres, attended by Madame Heloise Duret and several other midwives who had been involved in protecting Evangeline throughout the ordeal. The birth was difficult but successful. Mother and child both survived, which itself represented a victory given the medical risks and the traumatic circumstances of the pregnancy. Parish baptism records list the child simply as Marie Evangeline, with no father's name recorded, a notable omission that signaled the complicated legal status of a child born to a separated wife. The question of what happened to Evangeline and her daughter after 1833 requires piecing together fragments from various sources across decades. Unlike prominent families whose lives are exhaustively documented, women in Evangeline's position often disappear from official archives, their stories continuing in spaces that leave little paper trail. But enough evidence survives to trace the essential outlines of their lives and to assess the longer-term impacts of the case. Evangeline remained in New Orleans for approximately 3 years following her daughter's birth, living in the community of women who had offered her sanctuary. Records from the free women of color who ran the boarding house show her learning skills that would allow her to support herself: sewing, embroidery, and eventually mantua making, the specialized craft of creating women's formal dresses. By 1836, she was working as an apprentice to an established mantua maker, earning her own income and beginning to establish independence. Parish account books from St. Martin show the Boudreau estate entering a period of decline following the court case. Whether this decline was caused directly by the scandal or by other economic factors is unclear, but the trajectory is documented. Creditors forced a partial sale of enslaved people in 1834, sugar yields dropped, and by 1837 the property was operating at a loss. The big house remained standing and the family retained ownership, but the estate never recovered its former prosperity or influence. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau died in 1841, his obituary in the local newspaper noting his service as a planter and vestryman but making no mention of his family beyond his surviving sons. The case's most significant legacy unfolded not in legislative reform or official policy change. Louisiana Civil Code regarding paternal authority in marriage would not be substantially reformed until after the Civil War, but in the quiet accumulation of practices that individuals and institutions adopted to prevent similar situations. These changes were habits rather than laws, human guardrails erected where the legal code had proven insufficient. Madame Heloise Duret, whose ledgers and testimony had been crucial to Evangeline's case, began a practice that other midwives in Louisiana would eventually adopt: keeping duplicate ledgers. Her primary ledger recorded the basic medical information required for her practice. But she maintained a second, more detailed record that documented observations about patient circumstances, signs of coercion or distress, and information that might be needed if legal intervention became necessary. When Duret died in 1851, her descendants preserved both sets of ledgers, recognizing their historical importance. Years later, Duret told a younger midwife she was training, "Write what you see. Paper forgets, but we teach it to remember." This practice of detailed documentation by midwives and nurses, operating outside official channels but preserved against future need, became one way that women created accountability where legal systems failed to provide it. Notaries in St. Martin Parish, and gradually in neighboring parishes as word of the case spread, began adding procedures around marriage conveyances. While not required by law, some notaries started including a line in their documents: consent confirmed through private consultation without guardian present. This notation signaled that the notary had spoken with the bride separately from her father or other male relatives, creating at least a minimal verification that consent was more than scripted performance. The practice was not universal and could not prevent all coerced marriages, but it represented an acknowledgement that the mere presence of family authority was not sufficient evidence of voluntary choice. Parish priests and church officials, mindful of the ecclesiastical inquiry's failure in Evangeline's case, became more cautious about granting dispensations that abbreviated the normal marriage process. The standard practice of posting bans, announcing upcoming marriages publicly for several weeks to allow anyone with objections to come forward, had often been waived for urgent marriages or for families of prominence. After the Boudreaux case, some priests began insisting on the full process regardless of family status or claimed urgency, and several developed the practice of speaking privately with brides-to-be, particularly very young ones, before finalizing marriage arrangements. These were not officially mandated reforms but individual decisions by religious officials who had seen how quickly appearances of consent could be manufactured. Sister Ursule's cottage, which had served as sanctuary for Evangeline, began to take on a more formal role as a refuge. Supported by donations and eventually by a small bequest from a wealthy widow who had followed the Boudreaux case, the cottage expanded its mission to include not only nursing care but also temporary housing for women fleeing dangerous domestic situations. By the 1840s, it was recognized informally throughout the region as a place where women could go when they had nowhere else to turn. Sister Ursule trained other women to continue this work, creating a network of safe houses that operated across several parishes. These refuges existed in a legal gray area. Technically, a wife who fled her husband without court authorization was violating her marriage duties, but they provided immediate protection while legal remedies were pursued. Julien Arnaud, the attorney who had represented Evangeline, found that his practice changed significantly after the case. He began receiving requests from other families and other women in situations involving coerced marriages, problematic guardianship arrangements, and various forms of domestic control. He developed expertise in navigating the narrow remedies Louisiana law offered: separation of bed and board, guardianship challenges, property protections, and in building cases that focused on immediate safety rather than on broader challenges to male authority. His approach was pragmatic rather than revolutionary, working within legal constraints rather than trying to overturn them, but it created pathways for intervention where none had existed before. Perhaps most significantly, the Boudreaux case became a story that circulated, told and retold in communities across Louisiana and beyond. The details varied with each telling, but the essential narrative remained. A father sold his daughter, the law initially permitted it, a community eventually intervened, and a young woman survived. This story functioned as a warning and as a template. It warned families about the dangers of absolute paternal authority exercised without moral constraints. And it provided a template for how intervention might occur, through coalition building across social boundaries, through documentation by those outside official power structures, through strategic use of limited legal remedies, and through the courage of individuals willing to offer sanctuary and support despite social and legal risks. Evangeline's daughter, Marie Evangeline, grew up in this changed environment. Parish records show her apprenticed to a mantua maker at age 12, learning the same craft her mother had learned. At 20 in 1853 she married a carpenter named Etienne Marchant in a ceremony that was, by all accounts, entirely of her own choosing. The marriage record notes that she signed her own name with a steady hand, a detail that seems insignificant until one considers what it represented. A woman with autonomy, literacy, and the ability to consent freely to her own future, standing in stark contrast to her mother's experience at the same age. The Evangeline Boudreaux case did not end slavery, did not reform Louisiana's patriarchal legal code, and did not prevent all future instances of coerced marriage or paternal abuse of authority. What it did do was expose the mechanisms through which violence could be legalized and respectability could mask exploitation. It demonstrated that even in systems designed to protect male authority over female dependence, spaces existed for resistance, intervention, and ultimately accountability. It showed that whisper networks, duplicate ledgers, sanctuary cottages, and determined individuals could create protection where institutions failed to provide it. The case led to what might be called a local practice of verification. Not a law, not a policy, but a set of habits adopted by individuals who had seen what happened when consent was assumed rather than confirmed, when documentation was accepted at face value, and when authority was permitted to operate without scrutiny. These practices were fragile and incomplete, dependent on individual choice rather than systemic mandate. But they represented a lineage of awareness, a knowledge passed from midwife to midwife, from priest to priest, from attorney to attorney, about the distance between what the law claimed to protect and what it actually protected, and about the responsibility of those with even limited power to use it in defense of those with none. Years after the case, Madame Durit's words to a younger midwife captured the essential lesson. Write what you see. Paper forgets. We teach it to remember. The Evangeline Boudreau case serves as a reminder of what happens when we forget, when we allow legal formality to substitute for moral scrutiny, when we treat people as negotiable instruments, and when we mistake the appearance of consent for its reality. And it serves equally as a reminder of what becomes possible when we remember, when we document what we see, when we refuse to bless violence masquerading as respectability, and when we create networks of protection that persist even when official systems fail. This case led communities to learn, painstakingly and imperfectly, to call a sale by its name and refuse to bless it as a marriage. That lesson, hard won in 1833, remains relevant wherever legal systems intersect with human vulnerability, wherever authority can be weaponized against those it claims to protect, and wherever the work of creating genuine accountability continues.